And we're going. I'm here with Carolyn Elliott. Great to see you again.
Hi, Ruwan. Great to see you.
Yeah, I think the last time we spoke, was a podcast, which must have been many years ago.
It's our thing, apparently.
I guess so. Yeah, I vaguely remember you stopped in Midtown. I think you were coming back from Bali. You stopped in Midtown, and I was driving a taxi at the time, and I tried to meet you at the bus station, and then I didn't see you. And then that was our last interaction, I think. I don't know what year that was, maybe 2016 or something. But anyway, I want to talk about your book. I love it. I listened to it like in 2 days. I've been recommending it to a lot of people. It's been awesome. But before we talk about existential kink, I would love to know what your life has been like in the last couple of years. I know a lot of things have changed.
Oh, yeah. Well, I fell in love with a nice Pittsburgh boy, just like I always wanted to. Nice Pittsburgh man. And got married. I have a little house in a cute little neighborhood, and got 2 stepsons, got a little baby daughter, Elucis. I've been participating fairly a lot in medicine ceremony work. I've traveled to the Amazon to do that. A lot of online teaching and coaching. I have a life coach training program, Existential Kink Life Coach training program called Game of Sovereigns. We were doing that in LA with Dave Burns. But we couldn't do our last one in LA, obviously, because of all the virus and stuff, so we did it online. What else have I been doing? Reading and writing a lot.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of things.
It's a good amount, yeah.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, it was many years ago, but I think we were speaking, last time we spoke was, you had just had some big breakthroughs in money, and I think you were sharing like, oh yeah, your next thing was like relationships, and then the next thing I knew from you, you were married and had a child and had many children, and it's like that was a quick manifestation, at least from my perspective.
Thank you. No, it was quick. It's interesting how existential kink can work like that. I guess we could talk more about that a little later.
Yeah, I mean, very shortly, but you did mention the medicine ceremonies. It's interesting because you mentioned Brown, and I don't remember if you mentioned him by name, but I did a ceremony with Brown in Peru very randomly. Yeah, I think it was in 2017. I don't know what years are, but it was a couple of years ago. Louisa? I was visiting Louisa.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we heard some American shaman in town. Do you want to do a ceremony? I was like, oh, okay, sure, whatever. And it turned out he's from Pittsburgh, and he knew a couple Pittsburghians that. Anyway, so it was cool reading the book, and I was thinking about, because you mentioned ayahuasca a few times, and I had a great experience with him. And I was like, oh, it's the same person. Crazy. Anyways. Yeah,
That's weird, because there's like 500 shamans in Iquitos. That's interesting. And what's also interesting is 2017, that was before I ever worked with Brown. I only started working with him in, like 2018. So interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. What a world. And actually, I do want to say, I mean, I don't know what his presence on, or if he promotes himself or anything like that. I've done it quite a few times, and it was by far the best experience with him. Like, yeah, it was. Well, we could talk about my ayahuasca experiences maybe later. Existential Kink. Love the book. I've heard you speak and teach about it prior to the book coming out. But could you share what that means for those who don't know?
Sure. So the idea with existential kink is that all of us humans have sort of secret taboo desires that we keep hidden even from ourselves. And these are desires usually for things that kind of contradict what our ego wants. So our ego usually just wants good stuff, wealth, love, health, creativity, all of the stuff that promotes survival. So it's very strange, but there seems to be a part of us that is interested in experiences that don't necessarily further our survival, that don't necessarily further our status, that are just experiences. So this phenomenon of having hidden, secret, taboo desires was very well known to Freud and Jung and all the founding fathers of psychoanalysis and everything. But it got less talked about in popular psychology and self-help, basically because the idea is pretty darn offensive to our usual conscious minds, because the idea is that it's possible for us, a part of us, a secret part of us, to actually desire things that are painful, embarrassing, frustrating. And who knows exactly why? Could be karma, could be generational trauma, could be, I think it's just the human condition that our souls are interested in the whole spectrum of experience, including the rough bits. So with existential kink, basically what we do is we practice recognizing that incarnated life is a kind of kinky game. So sort of just like all over the world, people who practice BDSM, they set up scenes and agreements and safe words with their partners, and they create a scenario where they experience sensations that maybe in daily life they would not like those sensations, but within the context of the container and the agreements, they're able to give themselves permission to really enjoy and get off on sensations that they would not otherwise. So what's interesting with existential kink is we're talking about all of life. So there's no safe words in life. You can't, just yell out red and make everything stop. But what we can do is we can give ourselves a container of a meditation practice. So I suggest 15 minutes that people set a timer and just practice remembering their actual identity as a vast soul, a vast consciousness that decided to have a fun, incarnate experience, and go into the sensations connected to whatever situation it is in their daily life that they don't like, and experiment with seeing if they can find a way to be in relationship with those sensations, that they can let themselves experience them as pleasure instead of just, oh, this is so terrible, I want this to stop immediately. So that's a good part of it. And actually, it's usually very easy for people to experience sensations that they previously didn't like as pleasure. That's the easy part of existential kink. The more challenging part is once people begin to realize, like, oh, I do kind of enjoy this. Maybe a common example would be feeling anxious or stressed out about money matters and how am I going to pay the rent and how am I going to pay these bills. You can kind of tune into that and find that that anxiety is physiologically, it's arousal. There's the heart beats faster, the cheeks flush. There is a certain pleasure in it. Once we realize that pleasure, the next step is to find approval for that secret taboo desire. To really say to ourselves, like, it's actually okay that a part of me enjoys this.
Yeah.
Because until we do that, until we really make that taboo desire not taboo anymore and really accept it, it tends to keep repeating itself and playing out.
Yeah, you mentioned that quote by Carl Jung throughout the book that I wrote down so I could also say it, is that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. Yeah, and it's interesting because, not everyone is familiar with BDSM, so it might seem like a foreign concept, but anyone who likes watching horror movies or adventure movies where things get blown up or like weird stuff, like there's a reason why some part of you is entertained by whatever it is. You just know you can turn off the TV. So it's kind of like, well, it is kind of like you said, you can't call red, but if you do adopt a certain model of reality that you did just come down for a temporary existence, well, this is just a trip, and maybe you wanted to have some rough spots in the trip. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. Absolutely nobody would watch a movie where only good things happen. Even in comedies, the characters get into big pickles and have to figure it out. It's like we have, just like you were saying, an attraction to drama. And the thing is if we can just admit to ourselves, wow, I like this drama in my financial life, in my love life, in my health, in my creativity. I like it everywhere. I love the drama of feeling not good enough. I love the drama of feeling in bondage to other people's expectations. I love, just really, really get super honest and admit that enjoyment is not just limited to movies and TV, that it goes deep down into our lives, and really give ourselves permission to receive that enjoyment and to drink it all in and really, really have it. And as we do that, the compulsion to create that drama gets less and less.
Yeah, it's kind of like a different way of not dissolving the ego, but like you're really like, I'm really just a character in this movie, and sometimes this character is naughty, and that's just how it has to go. Or sometimes this character is whatever, the victim. I mean, it is kind of like, it is a challenging spiritual, I don't know, reworking of your perspective.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. So it's and that's why it takes practice. Like, that's why I recommend that people work on it daily, because it does take time. Like, applying this context and this perspective shift of it's truly a game, it's truly, you know, like a movie, and we can enjoy it in that same way, is definitely hard, because this is, gosh darn, it sure is a compelling world. Everything seems so tangible and so dire. And of course, we don't want to deny or suppress any emotions or any grief that we have in connection to experiences or situations. But existential kink is, I find it interesting because our culture is very into grieving and bemoaning in an extent. And so if something bad is going on in your life, you know, there's therapists you can easily find who will sit and listen to you talk about how terrible it is all day, and they will agree with you. And that's so wonderful. I think that's so needed so much of the time. But there's also a point that sometimes we get to where we're just like, I think I'm done grieving this. I think I'm ready to have a different relationship with whatever this thing is. And I'm excited for existential kink to offer that kind of new horizon of possibility for folks to be in relationship with their dramas and their struggles.
Yeah, for sure. I've always, not always, but more recently, I've thought like success is really just being able to choose your problems. Like, it's not being problemless. That would be boring, right? I want to ask you about one thing that is kind of like an assumption throughout the book, and it's something that I believe in, but I've been challenged by. And actually, in OneTaste, I had this debate with someone who is a recovered drug addict, and the assumption was you create your own reality. And I'm still very into the idea, but he was saying, oh, for some people that is a very dangerous idea. And he was saying like, oh, addicts have killed themselves with this idea of like, oh my God, if I create my own reality, why did I create all this terrible stuff? And I know you're familiar with addiction, have experiences, and I was curious what you say to that, because I didn't have a response to what he said at all.
Yeah, so it's difficult to talk about because, well, there's layers to it. One of the important layers, I would say, is that a key element to waking up magically, to waking up spiritually, is learning to not shame or blame oneself for what one has created, and understanding that the level of creation, so most people don't consciously create their experience. I would say for most of us, most of the time, it's more the collective unconscious that's creating what we're experiencing. And things in our personal unconscious. And there may be things in that personal and collective unconscious. So for example, I'll just take my life. I was born into a situation where my father was brain damaged. Oh boy, this is gonna go on its own huge tangent. Let me rearrange this a little
Totally
bit
up to you. I mean, I'm happy.
I know.
I'm happy to go on the tangent, but we don't have to go into it.
Early in the morning to dive into that. Let's just put it this way. We all have. It gets difficult to talk about the unconscious because it's the unknown. It's what we don't consciously identify with. But anyways, we all have patterns in us, in our souls, and those patterns draw forth certain situations, certain experiences, and it usually happens without our conscious awareness. And as far as I can tell, it takes a lot of work to become aware of what those patterns are and to fearlessly say, like, hey, Yes, there was some really terrible dark stuff in here. I was about to get started talking about my experiences with rape and sexual assault and all sorts of ugh, nothing that anybody would consciously be like, oh boy, sign me up for that, right? Except that I truly believe that some part of myself, my soul, was interested, compelled, fascinated by those experiences, just like people are interested, compelled, fascinated to watch, movies where that kind of stuff happens, just really interested in it. What is that like? What does that feel like? And realizing that, so a huge part of existential kink for me, and that I like to teach people, is really understanding that, so our ego tells us that it's only okay and we can only feel good about creating things that it likes, safe, sunny, whatever things. And part of the existential kink process is learning that we can love and approve of ourselves even as we recognize that our souls are involved in creating darker things. That doesn't have to mean that we're so bad or so terrible. What it means is that we are human and exactly like everybody else. My perspective these days with it is fairly metaphysical, and I struggle with that because I know that a lot of people haven't had, deep experiences of their whole series of incarnations, and it can sound nutty when you just start talking about it to somebody who hasn't had those visions for themselves yet. But it also, just practicing this attitude of relating to my life like it's a kinky scene or a kinky game, tends to take you deeper and deeper into that awareness of yourself as a soul who is down for the whole gamut of experiences and finds them all fascinating and all lovable. So another way that I talk about existential kink is it's just a practice of unconditional love. And the thing is, I find it funny because there's a lot of spiritual circles where people will give lip service to unconditional love, but actual unconditional love is gross, it's embarrassing, it's, because it involves super humbling oneself to things that are so bad and so awful, and basically really not judging, really surrendering that judgment and really relating to the world as an aesthetic experience instead of a moral experience.
Yeah. Well, as you're saying that, what came to me is like, oh, if you're going to accept that you create reality, you also have to accept, the acceptance is not just of yourself, it's also of the reality. So if you can approve of this terrible act, that wouldn't make, using that other person's example, it wouldn't make you go into this terrible spin. It's all one thing, right?
Yeah. And of course it's very tricky and it's easy to get hung up on this. And I always emphasize to people to never start with applying the principles of existential kink to the most traumatic, painful experiences in your life, to always just start with your daily frustrations. I think the gentleman who pointed out to you the idea that, creating your own reality can be a terrible idea for some people. I think that's very, very true for people who are really dominated, as addicts especially tend to be. I know because I was one, by shame and by guilt. When somebody really has that running, it's like they don't have the free, positive energy in their system, the kind of playfulness and perspective available to be able to start looking at their lives and being like, hey, you know what? Maybe I create stuff that's awful and stuff that's wonderful. Maybe I'm just infinite like that. And that's, again, why regular recovery work, regular grief work is fantastic for folks in those darker positions. And probably existential kink is more for people who have been down a lot of personal development and healing roads already and are just kind of looking for the next horizon, and they have some humor and they have some perspective.
Yeah. Because the major prerequisite seems to be you don't take things that seriously, or you can take things not seriously. Can I ask you about the addiction thing, if you don't mind? Because I noticed you said I was an addict, and I'm having an addiction expert on tomorrow, and I was going to ask him at this as well. But I've always had issues with the first step, And, I'm somewhat familiar, like just the idea of proclaiming I am an addict, I am powerless, just seemed like not cool for me, like to label yourself. And I have a lot of friends in recovery, and they might have been sober 20 years and they say, I am an addict. I can't, I was like, maybe you're not anymore. Maybe, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So, oh boy. So for 10 years, I said that every day at meetings. Hi, I'm Carolyn, I'm an addict. And for me, accepting that part of the first step was really super necessary. I was, totally abstinent from all substances other than nicotine and coffee for 10 years. And I look at it as sort of like, in Buddhist Tantra, before they teach you the weird tantric stuff, they make you spend a long time doing regular ascetic Buddhism where you are abstaining from stuff and everything. I sort of see it as my little ascetic training ground there, learning how to be basically honest and surrendered and things like that. I have some interesting thoughts about the 12 steps, and how they're very, very beautiful. I think they're like America's greatest contribution to the spiritual life of the world. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is, I say that I was an addict now because it's no longer my experience. My relationship with substances is nothing like it was back when I was 17 and I was struggling so much. And I talked to the woman who was my sponsor for those 10 years that I was in meetings all the time. And her reflection to me was just like, it's interesting, Carolyn, because she knows that I go to medicine ceremonies and drink wine with dinner and stuff like that. Is she was just like, I think the reason why your life has continued to be good is because you still really ask yourself penetrating questions, and you're always reflecting, and you're not going into a victim mode, basically. Because I think that that's kind of the crux of addiction is feeling like, how they talk about resentment and the triangle of self-obsession and everything like that, is like getting into this mode where the world has hurt me, so that means that I have free license to obliterate myself in some substance or behavior. Anyway, I don't know. I think I love it. I love in meetings how they tell people to say that for the rest of their lives. I think there's a deep wisdom to that. For me, it was just after about 10 years in, something was rearranging itself in my being, and I started being drawn to the weird tantric medicine path, which is not as compatible with the ascetic abstaining path.
Yeah. Or from like the movie analogy, you just got bored with that channel. Is that fair to say? I don't mean to oversimplify.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think that maybe some sort of healing, some sort of reordering happened with my brain and my consciousness, where it was just like the sort of insatiable, self-pitying, resentful drive that I used to have, which if I had relapsed in that mode would have taken me into yucky places. That part of my character actually resolved, changed. It was no longer the way that I related to the world. And so now I'm just able to have a better, more, I guess I would say, normal relationship with substances.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. So I loved a lot of the myths that you shared throughout the book. And one was the Persephone and Pluto myth. And one line that you brought out, which kind of relates to the rape thing we mentioned, but it was the idea that Persephone in some way created Pluto, or Pluto was her other half, even though he was the perpetrator. Could you say a little more about that? Because I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, so I'll just, just to refresh people's memories, the classic story of Persephone and Pluto is pretty grim. It's basically that Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, the grain goddess, and she's just hanging out in a meadow one day, picking flowers, innocent young girl, and the ground opens up, and this terrifying king of the underworld and his giant black chariot with giant black horses comes, grabs her, takes her down to the underworld, marries her, rapes her, keeps her kidnapped and away from the world that she knew and from her mother. And her mother goes looking for her and tries to bring her back to Mount Olympus, but she's already eaten 6 pomegranate seeds, which is the food of the underworld, so she can only go up half the year, and the rest of the time she has to stay in hell with her rapist. It's not a happy story. And it was just, I had been doing existential kink work for a while, and I had been pondering this story because it's part of the ancient mystery tradition that I'm very interested in. It was the main part of the Eleusinian mysteries. And one day I just sort of had this other vision.
Is that what you named your child after?
Yes, I named my daughter Eleusis after the place in Greece where they held those ceremonies.
Cool.
I was reading, I was reading a book of Greek history, and it was talking about how before there ever was a king of the underworld in Greek mythology, in the Greek mind, there was one primary goddess, Kore. She was a mother goddess. She was the goddess of everything, of the underworld, of new life, and Kore means heart, like the heart, the core of everything. And that it seems that mythologically, historically, at some point there was some innovations that happened, and Kore, instead of being the everything, the all goddess, totally omniscient, totally all powerful, the story somehow changed into she was the the kidnapped and raped bride of Pluto, the king of the underworld. And my mind just started getting really, really curious about this. And suddenly I just had a different understanding of what happened. And that's the myth that I tell in the beginning of my book. So here's my version of the Pluto and Persephone story, which is that one day, Kore, the great goddess, the heart of everything, totally omniscient, totally omnipotent, completely all-powerful, whole and complete unto herself, containing everything. She just got really, really bored with being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing. She was just sort of floating around in that bliss continually for millennia, and it just got old. And she started having this thought, like, I wonder what it would be like to actually experience my own strength, because I can't experience it because I'm whole, I'm undivided. There's no way for me to know myself and to experience myself. So she was pondering this, and she decided to split herself in 2 so she could have an experience of herself, and so that she could have an adventure, so that she could feel totally powerless because she'd been only experiencing herself as all-powerful for so long. She wanted to know what powerlessness and fear and terror and all of that was like.
Like watching a TV show or movie.
Exactly. So she decided, well, I'm going to split myself into 2 polarities. I'll be this sweet, innocent, defenseless little girl over here, and then over here I'll be this monstrous, evil, rapist, kidnapper guy. And I'll experience a drama. I'll experience this meeting of these parts of myself so I can feel them in a different way, so I can understand them better. So she set this whole thing into motion, divided herself, and the whole thing occurred. And then in my intuition of the story, one day she's in the underworld and she's feeling pretty awful because now she thinks she's just Persephone, this helpless, defeated young girl. And she takes the pomegranate, which is a beautiful fractal image of, the womb and the female genitalia and everything. And she eats 6 seeds. 6 in occult symbolism, Kabbalistic symbolism, happens to be the number of the heart. And as she eats these seeds, they're sort of like seeds of her memory and of her own wholeness coming back in. And she remembers who she really is. She remembers that she is the great goddess Kore, the heart of everything, the center and the mother and omnipotent and omniscient. And she remembers that she created this whole terrible, intense experience for entertainment. And rather than having to feel wrong or terrible or victimized, she can actually just let herself appreciate the depth and the wildness of the entertainment that she engendered, and her own courage and her own adventurousness. And as she begins to appreciate this and let the pleasure of it move through her, she recognizes that Pluto is part of her too. And then and not only is he part of her, but he's a part of her that was so willing to support her vast, intense creative vision that he played the part of this super evil villain just because he wanted her to have the experience she desired of getting to know herself in this different way. So then in my vision, they are then happily married, two, parts of the divine experiencing themselves in dialogue rather than in simple, unity. And that dialogue, that duality is what we're all in right now. And we all have the option of beginning to remember ourselves as that divine that decided to experience duality. And this is something that I ponder about a lot, because in some ways it's so unfair that we don't automatically remember being these great divinities. And it seems like we just are stuck here. We didn't ask to be here. All this stuff is happening to us against our wills. And boy, are we enslaved. I mean, we're just slaves to our habits, slaves to our bodies, slaves to money, slaves to other people's actions and judgments. And anyways, so we have this veil of forgetting. And part of the work of any spiritual tradition is beginning to penetrate through that veil of forgetting to remember who we are. And one of the things that I think is really cool about existential kink and other tantric practices is that it really works with the actual electricity of the body to take this knowing into an embodied sexual, emotional level, and not just an intellectual level. Because Lordy, I've been in so many hippie circles in my life where people are talking about how, we're all divine, and blah, 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 and their lives are complete messes, and it's just like, they haven't centered that in their bodies, and so they're not able to align their system with it. So that's something that I'm very, very interested in, is helping people have really practical, concrete, beautiful experiences of themselves and the world. And that's one of the things I like about EK, is it helps people do that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you just mentioned there's a physical component to it. It's not just thinking, it's like, yeah, okay, I'm an infinite being, I'm here, whatever, and then you forget about it when you're off to work. But like, there's a physical component, and it seems necessarily sexual, or is that just an easy lens or easy gateway into it, sexuality?
Mm-hmm. I think that it's not necessarily sexual in the sense that when we make conscious the unconscious enjoyment, the previously unconscious enjoyment that we may have had in something, it can arise as a sexual level of enjoyment. It can also arise as like laughter or humor. Basically, it can come through different energy centers of the body, or just like a melting warmth in the heart kind of thing. So, is it necessarily sexual? I think, though, there is a part of me that wants to say yes, but I don't want to say yes, because I know that some people practice existential kink and they're never able to get to the sexual sensation, but they're still able to have. It's
necessarily physical, right? Like there has to be a sensation, and might as well have it be a pleasurable one if you're going to.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I noticed, I was surprised actually that later in your book you brought up, I mean, surprised only because I wasn't expecting it, Orgasmic Meditation and that later. And I mean, I obviously was in that world for a long time, and I've adopted this view, or for a long time I viewed the world as like every moment is a stroke, and I'm either stroking in resonance with reality or I'm not, or I'm getting off, I'm not. And it was interesting because I shared your book with a friend who had never heard of oming before me and didn't really know anything about it. And she messaged me like a few days ago. It's like, I learned how to get off on everything. I'm getting off on everything. It's like, oh, it was so weird to hear that from someone who had never heard of OneTaste. I was like, what? But anyway, could you share a little bit about the stroke metaphor, or maybe the literal side of it?
I'm happy to. Yeah. I learned a lot of interesting things in my time around the OneTaste world, as I'm sure that you did too. And I think that teaching, which obviously was based on clitoral stroking and then made into a metaphor of like everything in our experience as a stroke, that started to affect me pretty deeply, because one of the things that I really enjoyed and benefited from in orgasmic meditation was the idea that most of the time, most people will have a very small range of sensation that they will allow themselves to experience as pleasurable, and that with practice and deliberate intention, you can really expand that range of sensation. So as I was working with orgasmic meditation, I found that was very true of me and my clitoris. My clitoris, starting out, only had a small range of strokes that I knew how to experience as pleasurable. And I became very interested in the idea of expanding that range. And I found that I could with practice in orgasmic meditation. And so then I started thinking about, that saying, everything in life is a stroke. And in some ways that was a big part of the inception of Existential Kink, because I got to be very, very curious. Like, well, is that really true? Can I really expand the range of things I can enjoy in life? Like, can I enjoy getting a big, fat, unexpected bill in the mail? Can I enjoy being dumped by somebody I have a crush on? What can I really? I can enjoy that? Maybe? Really? Well, maybe I really can, because I found out that I could do it, with my body, with my genitals. Let's try it. So that's one of the ways that it arose for me. I also am friends with Leslie, whose last name for some reason is escaping me right now.
Rogers. Yeah. From Light Dark Institute.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love the work that he and his partner Tawny do. I think it's so brilliant. And Leslie, I met him in OneTaste, and he, of all people, seemed to take this idea of getting off on every stroke more seriously than anybody else. Like, I remember one day I talked to him, and he seemed like he was really sad, like he was like crying. And I was like, Leslie, are you okay? And he was like, I'm so wonderful. But it wasn't happy tears. It was still like miserable tears. And I was like, wait, are you sure that you're wonderful? It's okay. We can talk. And he was like, I just hate myself so much right now. And it feels so good. And I was just like, and I had a number of those conversations with him, because I thought at first that he was like being sarcastic or ironic or something. And I gradually realized he really wasn't. He really was learning how to like super enjoy these kind of devastating states that most people spend their whole lives hating and avoiding. And so that example was inspiring to me, and I would be like, I'm going to practice until I can enjoy being humiliated as much as I know that Leslie is able to enjoy being humiliated. And then, you lose your fear of humiliation, and the possibilities of life grow wider.
Yeah, it was fun revisiting these ideas through your book after many years, because I was so into that. I was looking at life from more of a stroker's perspective of like, I need to stroke reality with perfect resonance. I need to tune into reality's body, and but viewing it from the strokey, the receiver's perspective is also interesting. Like in orgasmic meditation, very practiced strokey has such a wide range that the stroker can win with them with anything. Like, they don't have to, as like, what is it like to have life win with me? Like, and that's been like a fun way to look at things, like to actually be in connection with reality on maybe a more, the physical component makes it feel more real. Like, a lot of these things may seem foreign until you feel it in your body. And stroking a clitoris is one way, at least analogously. Analogously,
yeah, totally. And it's really deep, because it reminds me, of all those wonderful Rumi poems about like the beloved and the, connecting with the divine as a lover. And Yeah, and the lover is stroking us in all ways all the time, and we're stroking it through just existence.
Yeah. And I guess to bring it to maybe a way newer people can like get it more, like, and even going back to the Persephone Pluto idea of like they were one person. Like if you're in a fight with your partner, or like you feel oppressed by your narcissist lover or whatever it is like to really adopt the idea of like, oh, we're doing this like drama together and we're like both working on this play together. It really takes the edge off of whatever mean things you're saying to each other.
It does, and it allows you to forgive each other a lot quicker, I find. So, like me and my husband, I like to call it improvisational theater when we have a fight. Because we'll absolutely say ridiculous things that we don't mean, and we'll, slam doors and yell and all the things. And it used to be like when our relationship was fairly new, we'd have one of these fights, and then I wouldn't know how to get, back to center again, and it would be this big struggle to take us a week to get, connected again. And now it's like we can have one of those outbursts and 15 minutes later I'll be like, oh, he was just saying that stuff in my head that I say to myself, and I can really see how I drew that out of him because I wanted to experience that externally instead of internally. And instead of having to be like, why was he so mean? How could he be so mean to me? It's just like, oh, I know exactly how he was that mean. I drew it out with my, little fun witch power there. So yeah, it makes it, you
Yeah.
stop taking yourself so seriously.
Yeah, because it's not like you develop stability necessarily. It's more like you become fluid. It's like you don't get stuck in either direction. It's like more like being a clown. Yeah, just being fluid. And even Leslie's thing of like really being wonderful in tears. I mean, that's kind of like what clowns do for our entertainment, but to just be the clown, be the fool.
That's an amazing deep thing. You said it, the fool, like the zero in the major arcana. That's what we all are anyway.
Yeah.
So practicing it and realizing it is, I think, a fantastic thing to do.
Yeah. I want to ask another procedural thing, because you used terms I'd never heard before, Solvay and coagula.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. So those terms come from alchemy. So I like to think that existential kink is part of the alchemy of the psyche, which Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell really started to bring to the forefront in the 20th century. The terms themselves have a relationship to plant alchemy and metal alchemy. So the idea is that you take a substance and you dissolve it in order to then rearrange it, recoagulate it into a more potent form. So the example from plant alchemy would be, let's say I wanted to make a really powerful spagyric tincture. So I would take roses and I would take the actual flowers.
Spagyric?
Yeah, so spagyric in plant alchemy is it's a fancy kind of tincture. It's a tincture that's stronger than regular tinctures because it includes all three parts of the plant. It's alcohols, it's essential oils, and it's minerals that have been deliberately first separated and then recombined in a fashion that makes the medicinal element of the plant more potent and more active. Yeah. So exactly. So if you eat a handful of rose petals, not as much will happen to you as if you take a dropper full of rose spagyric. So the idea is you would soak the plant material in alcohol, its oils will dissolve out into the alcohol, and then you would, and the plant matter would start to decompose, and then you would separate the alcohol from the plant matter. And then you would incinerate the rose petals soaked in alcohol until you had calcified them and they turned to ashes. They'd been reduced to their minerals. And then you would gradually reincorporate those minerals back in with the alcohol and the essential oils. And then you have the spagyric tincture. So this idea, I think a simpler analogy to understand in nature caterpillars, right? So caterpillars are just crawling around, eating leaves, and one day they spin themselves into a cocoon and they dissolve completely. They dissolve into goo. And then they somehow manage, through their DNA knows how to do this, they recoagulate themselves into a completely different shape that some might say is more beautiful and more evolved and more refined and more powerful than the initial caterpillar shape, right? Usually the butterfly has a lot of colors to its wings. It's able to fly. The caterpillar wasn't able to fly. I think it's fascinating because in Greek, the Greek word psyche meant butterfly. That's what it meant, first and foremost, butterfly.
I didn't know that.
I think that's very, very telling. I think that tells us that they understood and that we need to understand that the psyche, in order to get to that more evolved, beautiful, flying form, which is also fascinatingly symmetrical, right? Like you look at a butterfly wings and they're like a Rorschach test. They're like a little mandala unto themselves of symmetry. Is we have to learn how to dissolve our old ways of being and reformulate ourselves. And then we can have that whole psyche that is so much more powerful and so much more beautiful and has so much more possibilities to it than when we're just kind of crawling along. And that's what the alchemy of the psyche is all about. It's about learning processes, meditations, disciplines, indulgences that help us dissolve the old patterns and the old ways of being that are usually unconscious, usually inherited, usually have big influence from collective forces like family and politics and religion. How we start to break those down so that our deepest essence of our soul that knows exactly what shape we want to be, that's fully individual, wholly original, can instead, direct the shaping of how we are, and we can be butterflies.
Can you give an example of like the dissolution or the Solvay part? Because I'm sure most people can imagine like, oh, I'm going to build myself up. Most self-help is I'm going to build myself according to this intention. But what does it mean to dissolve, or what does it look like to dissolve your caterpillar self?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you are completely right about that. I always say that, which is that most all of self-help and magic and visualization and law of attraction is all about the coagula phase, as if that were the only thing. And most people have no notion what the Solvay phase is like. And the Solvay is actually the first phase. It's the most important in some ways. So for me, there's a few different processes that I use for Solvay. I love the work of Byron Katie. I love those inquiry processes of just like writing down a judgment. Is it true? Can I absolutely know that it's true? Who would I be without that thought? Or what happens?
Are you familiar with the Sedona method?
Oh yeah, I love the Sedona method too.
Similar, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Would I let that go? Could I let it go? So both the Sedona method and the Byron Katie method, one of the ways that they accomplish their Solvay, so it's most obvious in the Byron Katie method. So it's like, how do I react when I believe that thought, and who would I be without that thought? So those questions bring up opposite experiences, and they allow us to. They can it's like it precipitates a confrontation of the opposites
and not take it so seriously. So I guess good.
The same thing in the Sedona method. Like some of the Sedona method questions are, can you let yourself feel as happy as you do about that? Can you let yourself feel as unhappy as you do about that? And it's kind of like whenever we bring those opposites together in close proximity, it can have that Solvay effect of dissolving attachment to rigid attachment to one side or the other.
That's interesting, like looking at like I guess any kind of inner conflict, if you can really accept both sides of an argument, you have to take a higher perspective. So I guess it just clicked for me now. Cool.
That higher perspective is what Jung called the transcendent function. And that's what he also identified with the self with a capital S. And you're nailing it exactly. It's that learning to hold paradox, learning to, two things can be equally true, and really, really getting that. you can't live with that realization without centering yourself in the heart, because it's not a brainy thing. It's definitely a heart thing. And so likewise, existential kink, I think, is a brilliant Solvay practice, because we are practicing bringing together our drama and our pleasure in it, our pain and our pleasure in it. And likewise, the two opposites, the more we bring them together and the more we are able to hold the paradox at once. So for example, in conventional law of attraction, if something, you don't like something in your life, let's say you're stuck in a job and you don't make a lot of money, they'll say, like, just ignore that, focus on the positive, imagine your bountiful future, blah, 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 right? It's all about ignoring whatever the piece is that you don't like. Existential kink is not about ignoring anything. It's about saying, like, yeah, I'm broke. It fucking sucks. It hurts. I'm humiliated. I feel these sensations of anxiety and worry. Like, that's happening. And also, another thing that I'm willing to now become aware of that's happening is how much this is so fascinating and so much fun, and I'm letting myself enjoy this whole scenario. So bringing together simultaneously the pain and the enjoyment, and holding that paradox takes us into that heart awareness that is connected to our larger self. And that's how we liberate the energy in that old pattern. So this, I keep using the financial situation because that was how I first started working with existential kink myself. So it comes most easily to mind. Because, you knew me back in the day. I was living with roommates. I was always, it was always a struggle for a while. And then gradually it became way super easier. And I realized it had so much to do with, as long as I was locked into this pattern of like feeling sorry for myself, of feeling like the world was against me and fate was against me, and it just was handing me this awful situation that I hated so much. And that was my only view of it, right? That was just like right here. It was like I was locked, my energy was all locked into repeating that and just experiencing it again and again. And when I was able to do the Solvay with it through a combination of the Sedona method, of the work of Byron Katie, of existential kink, the energy that had previously gone into hating and resisting the situation now was like orgasmically liberated. It was just loosened up. And as soon as that energy was loosened up, I think it took, it was a few weeks of me working on it in a really concentrated fashion. Suddenly I had all sorts of ideas and all sorts of inspirations about how to make way more money in my business. And they weren't like, they were pretty obvious. There were books about them. These were known business models. These weren't like crazy, not that innovative. But it was like before I had done that Solvay work, I was just completely blinded to these possibilities. They were like not for me. They were not even on the horizon. Like, ooh, running launches. Oh, that's so tacky. Why would I ever do that, right? But then after I did the Solvay work, I was like, you know what? I could do some internet. I could do launches. I could do that. And then boom, boom, suddenly way more money and way more fulfillment in my career.
Yeah, so it's a drop of resistance, basically. I mean, you're spending energy some way. You might as well do it in your direction.
Yeah, I think, that's like the Wayne Dyer quote, like what you resist persists. And Eckhart Tolle talked a whole bunch about that too. And I think that is just so, so true. So when we learn how to stop resisting things that we don't like and learn how to kinkily get off on them instead, all of that energy is liberated and we can use it to shape and create different forms in our lives.
Cool. I think we froze for a second, but I think we're back. Do you mind if we go a little bit over time? I have one last question topic.
No, it's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Because I wanted to ask you about the occult, and if you don't mind, if you don't want to speak about it, it's fine. But I think I heard you mention a while ago that like you were even raised in the kind of like a pagan, I think you mentioned being in rituals when you were younger. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that? Because everything I know of magic is more of a conceptual or metaphoric way of viewing the world. I'd love to hear about the real stuff.
Yeah, we'll have to get you in a ritual sometime. The real stuff. Okay, well, so I think the most beautiful rituals that I was a part of when I was young were put on by the local Druid group, and they had a beautiful liturgy. They would invoke different gods and goddesses surrounding the holidays of the solar year, so the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and such pageantry and such poetry. So there would be a priest and priestess, and they'd be dressed up, and there'd be, carrying in offerings, cakes and fruit and honey and wine.
And was this like organized around a religion or like just a organization?
So that group was about Druidry, which there's a whole organization. I'm forgetting what it's like, American Druid something, but it's like inspired by recreations of those.
Okay. So it wasn't like a secret society as much.
No, it wasn't a secret society. No, OneTaste was probably the main secret society that I was.
Gotcha. Okay.
They were all like free to the public, advertised things. So, well, okay, I guess secret society. My father was a Rosicrucian, so I was also involved in that. So I was a Vestal Virgin in a Rosicrucian temple dedicated to Thoth when I was 11 years old. So
Gotcha.
For me. And that Rosicrucians are a secret, they're not really a secret society. You can sign up on the internet, you show up at your local Rosicrucian office, and you're like, hey, I will volunteer to bring salad every Sunday if you let me dress up. And they're like, okay, you're it.
But they do some pretty trippy stuff. Like they actually practice telepathy and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. All of it. No, I love the Rosicrucians. They're super deep. I love, the Druids, the Wiccans, the Rosicrucians, the Thelemites. I'm fond of the whole Aleister Crowley scene, although I've never really super hung out with the official crowd. There's so many different flavors, and they're all so interesting. But I think if you want to get more into magic, Ruwan, I can tell you that a really fun place to start is planning and designing your own rituals, and then taking some psychedelics and going out and doing them, and finding out what happens.
That type of magic I'm fairly familiar with.
Okay.
I guess, we don't have to get into this much, but actually a member of the Om community shared this documentary with me, Out of the Shadows. I don't know if you're familiar. It's about like the Pizzagate scandal. And it was a conspiracy, so I kind of brushed it off, but I watched the thing anyway, and it had all these like satanic rituals where like really terrible things happen, like beyond metaphoric stuff. And I was like, man, I wonder how many, because I've entertained Satanism as like a concept of following your feelings. I read the Satanic Bible. I thought, there's a lot of great metaphors in here. Then when I saw like what people are actually doing with it, or allegedly doing with it, I was like, whoa, are people I know like doing? I don't know. I was wondering if you had any familiarity with that kind of magic.
So Satanism, Anton LaVey. Okay, so let's see. How do we say this? I think in the magical world, it's exactly like every other part of the world. There's some folks practicing it who are super cool and super wholesome in a really deep, real way, in the sense that they have explored and integrated, usually imaginatively or through ritual or psychedelically, all these various taboo parts of themselves, and come into deep acceptance with them, and are just really awesome. And then there's people who are imbalanced and don't really understand the deeper underlying principles, and take some things in nutty directions. So I have not ever personally witnessed anything that, all of my experiences of abuse were just sort of casual Appalachian abuse. They weren't like dedicated, ceremonies to it. I do think that probably happens in the world. There's a very, very interesting book called I think it's called The Game of Saturn, and it's actually about one of the first tarot decks that was ever created, which is very, very mysterious. Why can't I remember it now? Honey, Taya, are you around? The Solabuska. Would you grab the book? Anyways, it's a book that it details very, very convincingly how the modern banking system was created through people practicing a form of Saturnian magic. So Saturn, Saturn in astrology is associated with Satan. It's the adversary. It's the force of time, limitation, the shadow, all of these things. Oh yeah. So I'm just gonna pull up a picture for you or two. But you can see it's this old Italian tarot deck. And the whole tarot deck depicts this kind of magic, including child sacrifice, which was at times in history associated with Saturnian gods. So, like Moloch, like there was a whole, everything. So I do kind of have a feeling that there are institutions still today in the world that are fueled by this particular kind of magic, which may involve actual harm to children. And that, of course, is very sad and I would say completely unnecessary and misguided. But I guess they might see it as necessary in the sense that this particular kind of magic is very intense, obviously. Like any time that you're creating that kind of harm, it opens up, you could say, even like rips in space-time. It has
a lot of sensation.
There's a lot of sensation. There's an efficacy to it in that dimension, and that it unleashes a lot of power that can be channeled into really long-term goals, like the long-term control of the economy or the currency system, or like there's so I would never say that there's nothing to that. And I would also say that by the same token, so the kind of magic that, for example, the Game of Saturn is what it's called, the kind of magic, that's a certain kind of theurgy. And like I said, it's theurgy associated with Saturn. There's other kinds of theurgy. So theurgy just means God work, like working with deities to produce magical change. So there's other kinds of God work that are much more benevolent, let's say. So I've worked a lot with Venus, and that work is all about beauty and harmony and sensuality and fun things like that. Well, thank you for raising the question, Ruwan, because it's an important thing that should be touched on when we talk about these matters, because it's certainly like, I guess one of the ways that I think about it is that magic, the occult, all of the correspondences, all of the deities, it's a form of technology. It's a form of technology that we can navigate. And, technology can be used for beautiful purposes in beautiful ways, or it can be used in very kind of twisted ways.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I can relate to it is the Star Wars universe, where the dark side of the Force is typically stronger in one-on-one confrontation, but obviously it deals with pain and the negative, terrible things, but it's less sustainable. I don't know. I guess that's maybe more true in real life than I previously considered. Anyways, thank you so much for this is very enlightening. I'm making notes of things I want to do EK with in my own life. Your book's on Amazon. It's everywhere where books are sold, right?
Yeah, and Audible. I'm excited for.
Oh yeah, I listened to the audio, and I appreciate that it was read by the author. It was great. Yeah. And where else can people find out about your work? I know you have a bunch of courses and other fun things.
So if folks go to my website, which is carolyngraceelliott.com, especially carolyngraceelliott.com/free, they can enter their email address through the forms on the site, and they will be added to my email list, which is the main way that I communicate about things that I'm doing. And they can also follow me on Instagram. I'm at Carolyn Elliott _. And so I've sort of channeled the focus of my work into one main program. It's called Wealth, and it's fabulous. We have really intense community socializing and bonding. We do the old turn-on games. We call them power-ups now, and we do those on Zoom. And I do mentorship sessions surrounding both business and esoteric alchemy of the psyche stuff. And yeah, it's delightful. So I will be reopening that at the end of May. So if folks tune into my Instagram and my email list, they can hear way more about Wealth. And a cool thing about Wealth is the practices that I teach in there. Folks have had an average influx of income of $50,000 associated with these practices. And that's usually just the beginning for people. So I call it Wealth because it's about physical, spiritual, emotional, financial wealth.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Super exciting. Well, thank you so much. This has been super fun. Yeah.
Likewise, Ruwan. Great to see you. Bye-bye.